Welcome everybody to NWSOFA. It is not Northwest SOFA, it's Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action. We were founded about 13 years ago as an OFA, Organizing for Action group. And about 6 years ago, we joined Indivisible. And we're located in the Northwest suburbs of Chicago. Karl likes to refer to that as the land beyond O'Hare. That's where we started. We are part of Indivisible, which has thousands of chapters across the U.S. The other day, we heard from our co-founders that we've just added 300 more chapters and many, many, many more that have been revised and restarted. So it is just a great, great organization that is driving us through this very difficult time. NWSOFA is organized on the twin snowflake system. On the right-hand side, you have our issue groups. On the left-hand side, we have our communications group. Both of those have grown greatly. We started, as I said, 13 years ago, right at the time of Sandy Hook, and our very first issue group was gun violence prevention. None of our groups have stopped. We moved then to healthcare reform, immigration reform, social justice reform, each one at different times, almost every year, every other year. Then we added a Stand With Women group, a fiscal and economics group, which Karl and David will be talking about today, our election outreach group, federal, state, and local. We have a climate change group, a Restore Our Democracy, that's called ROD. We have two groups of that, one that started with the basic voting rights, elections, gerrymandering, vote by mail, and then a newer group which was evolved around confronting disinformation and now basically attacks the issue of the day that's coming out from the current administration. And those are our 10 current issue groups. And almost every month, these groups will have a program that we put on Zoom. Secret sauce of our group is we have 24 co-leads that help the organization. They're organized by the issues groups, those in turquoise, and many people also are working on the communication side. We couldn't do it without it. They're our secret sauce. And if you'd ever like to become a part of our communications part or part of the social groups, let us know. A lot that NWSOFA is doing has been aided by the advent of Zoom. We used to have in-person meetings in a very tight area of 6 townships of about 900,000 people. Today, we do our Zooms across the U.S. We have people that'll be on here from all states, plus several different countries. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we have our coffee and conversation at 9 a.m. It's just a place for people to come and talk. It's not a presentation. And then we do the same thing every Friday night on a happy hour. We actually call it now the unhappy happy hour. We have, for those locally in the area, we have Indivisible Gather Pizza Nights, where we sit down and talk about issues. And we're all about trying to find ways of getting people to talk and to keep involved. Tonight, we have our longtime fiscal and economics co-leads, Karl Faulstich and Dave Doney. They've been doing this for probably 9 years of the 11 years that we've had a fiscal and economic review monthly. They do a fantastic job. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Karl.
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the Fiscal and Economic Issues Discussion Group, our February 2025 meeting. We didn't screw that up this month. Good for us. Anyhow, one of the things we want to do here is help you understand what the facts are going on with the economy and with the budget issues, as well as, use those facts to sharpen your arguments and communicate to your audience. We're going to start by going through items in the labor market, and then we'll cover GDP, or gross domestic product growth, then budget and economic outlook, key measures for African American families, some other economic measures, and some action items. And then at that point, we'll cover Keith's issues. In the chat, there should be a link to this PowerPoint. I've dropped it in a couple of times about 5 minutes ago, so hopefully somebody can keep dropping it in as need be. In terms of economic data, the monthly employment reports, jobs report is perhaps the most important economic news release. It comes out typically on the first Friday of every month. So it came out on the 7th this month. It's going to come out on the 7th next month. And we're going to use those and actually the folks mainly use those as the main indicators for whether or not we're in a recession. Typically 100 to 150,000 jobs added is pretty much a steady as she goes economy, holds the unemployment rate relatively constant along with other data. Anything over 150,000 is robust job creation. We now have roughly 160 million people that have jobs. Payroll jobs figures are based upon the Giant Establishment Survey of Employers. It's one of two surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does. The other is the Household Survey, which isn't quite as extensive, but actually picks up people who are working gig jobs, 1099 jobs, things like that. So your Uber and Lyft drivers, your Grubhub delivery drivers, etc., that are not employees of anybody but independent contractors. There were 143,000 payroll jobs added in January. Prior months were adjusted up by another 100,000. So it looks like 243,000 increase in jobs versus previously. Job creation has averaged about 337,000 jobs per month under Biden, 16.1 million total since he took office in 48 months. January is a Biden month because the survey is done during the week containing the 12th. So it's the 12th to the 18th, and Trump was inaugurated on the 20th. So we measure this versus January of 2025 minus January of 2021. And what we see here, the latest is 159.1 million. If you go and since you see here is that we reached the pre-pandemic peak in June of 2022. And since then, we've added 6.7 million jobs. We've been adding jobs at 217,000 jobs per month. Again, very good numbers versus what we were saying before. Anything over 150, 160,000 is a really strong month. We see here the rolling job creation, 3-month average, which went down below 100,000 in the middle of the year, is now back up over 200,000, even though the most recent month was at 143, because the month before that was at 300,000 or something like that. And if we look at job creation under Biden versus Trump versus Obama's second term, what we see is that we talked about Biden, 337,000. Even once we're fully recovered to the pre-pandemic level, it's been at 217,000. Obama's second term was at 216,000 jobs per month. Trump's pre-pandemic total was 180,000 jobs per month. In his 4 years, we lost 57,000 jobs per month, or a little over 2 million jobs over the course of 4 years. The first president with job losses since Herbert Hoover. Okay, we mentioned that there was a big revision in there. Is that what this is about or something else?
This is the full benchmark revision. So this was for the whole year when they went back and revised the job numbers, which they routinely do every year.
Yeah.
And it only reduced the number by about 236,000 in terms of 2.2 million jobs became 2 million jobs.
Okay. Yeah, last summer, they talked about the fact that there was going to be a major adjustment to the jobs numbers. And that went into this. So the 2024 numbers went down. I think 2023 numbers went down as well, if I'm correct. So the total adjustment was in the neighborhood of 500,000 jobs. So the unemployment rate tells us what percentage of the labor force is not working. To be in the labor force and be counted as unemployed, you have to have been available for work and you have to have looked for work in the prior month or 4 weeks and do not have worked at all in the prior month. So the historical average is about 5.7% going back all the way to 1948, and is 0.5 unemployment work, looked for work actively in the past month, is available for work, and doesn't have a job. And the unemployment rate is the number of unemployed divided by the number of unemployed plus the number of employed, or the labor force, which is not everybody in the country, because there's a number of people who are retired, like me, who don't get counted in these numbers. This only goes back to the end of Trump's term. What we see is that his low point was at the beginning of 2020 with a 3.5% unemployment rate. We went up and lost over 20 million jobs in 2 months in the first half of 2020 due to the pandemic. The Biden start was at 6.4%. We reached a low of 3.4%, and we're currently sitting at 4.0%. If we were to take this back, Trump started with an unemployment rate of 4.7%. And so over his term, the unemployment rate went from 4.7% to 6.4%, which is consistent with the fact that we lost jobs on his watch. And we'll see with the deportations, et cetera, and all the people getting let go, whether he becomes the second president in recent memory, or does it for the second time to be the president with net job losses on his watch. Average unemployment rate by year, the unemployment was coming down. Again, by the end of Obama's term, we were at 4.7%. Over Trump, it went down and then went back up. Under Biden, it had gone down and it's now bounced back up a little bit. Although it did get up to 4.2 or 4.3% recently before coming back down to 4%. And this is the unemployment rate by president. So what we see is that the average under Biden was 4.1%, which is actually the lowest. Closest to that was Truman at 4.2% and LBJ at 4.2%. Trump's average was 5%. Carter was at 6.5%. Reagan averaged 7.5%. Of course, Carter's reputation as having a lousy economy was not true. But unemployment has gone up since its low, reached its low about 2 years ago, and has come about 1.1 million since then. But obviously it's come down since Biden's start, or 10.2 million, got down to 5.7, now back up to 6.8, which is still relatively low, but especially with a 4% unemployment rate. But we'll see what happens to it over the coming year. Again, and I don't know whether we mentioned this at the beginning, the January numbers are Biden numbers. The employment surveys are done during the week containing the 12th to the 18th. Trump was inaugurated on the 20th. So the employment numbers are Biden numbers. Next month's, the February numbers, which will come out on March 7th, will be Trump numbers. And we'll see what happens then and going forward from there on the employment front. Some numbers will still be Biden numbers after that, but not on the employment front. Well, there will be 2 months of revisions to the January numbers in February and March. We'll see what happens then as well. The employment to population ratio for the prime working age people, which does not include people doesn't include many students or doesn't include many people who are retired, tends to exclude them. We see is that it's just about where it was in the pre-pandemic peak, maybe slightly higher. It was higher, I think, back during the dot-com boom 25 years ago. This is the ratio of job openings to the number of unemployed. We see is that we currently have job openings slightly higher than the number of unemployed. That's been true since early 2022. We obviously had unemployment higher than job openings when over 22 million people lost their jobs in a couple of months here, and it took a while to get them back. Actually, we talked about that these didn't come back until June of 2022. So the ratio of job openings to unemployed, there's 1.1 jobs for every person who's unemployed. But that doesn't match up quite perfectly with skills and geography, which is why we have certain people that are unemployed now, even though we have more jobs for them that are not filled. And let's see if there's questions on the labor market data. I don't know if there's anything in the chat or.
There are a bunch in the chat. The most recent was, how does the firing of federal employees impact our economy? And then there also, that's from Bobby Hill, and from Dr. Chris Weld, it was, our undocumented workers part of the employment stats. Those are two.
I'll handle the second question first. The answer is yes, they are. If they're on a payroll, they're counted. And if they're not on a payroll, but they're doing gig jobs of some sort, and they respond to the telephone survey that they're employed, then they're counted as employed. The mass layoffs all happened after the 20th, so none of that effect will be in these numbers. They will start seeing that impact in the February numbers next month. And depending upon how many layoffs we have and how many deportations we have, the impact may be small or it may be large.
There was a question around the kind of the impact that all of these layoffs are having, and we'll see over time what that is. We don't have the official data yet. It's going to take a couple more months probably for that to start really showing up in the jobs numbers and the unemployment rate. But just keep in mind, federal employment, all of the federal employees are about 3 million, and we lost 22 million jobs in the pandemic. So even if they fired the entire federal government, which they're not going to do, it wouldn't be as bad as the pandemic numbers. And that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And a lot of this is going to get blocked. I mean, the lawsuits are still working their way through. But if the president is overriding the will of the Congress and basically saying, you appropriated the money to staff these organizations, but I'm not going to let you staff them, that's a clear violation of something called the Impoundment Act. It's impounding the money essentially, and that is exceeding his authority. And so that's why people say we have a constitutional crisis, because the president is trying to take over the Congress, and his Republican buddies in Congress are happy to let him do it, at least so far. So we will see how this pans out and how the legal system handles it. We don't know all the answers yet, but the New York Times, if you search for it, I'll put a link in here, has an article that is tracking all of the litigation. And so you can see all the lawsuits, and they're just building it, and they're updating it as things change. So it's a really useful public service, and I will, after we talk here briefly, I'll put it in the chat. But, we just don't know yet. A lot of this stuff has not hit the official numbers yet. Karl and I are going to give you a report out of January. And then as the official numbers start to get hit and there's commentary around that, we'll share that with you.
Karl, also, Sarah Bingham asked a question. Does the 3 million federal employees include postal workers?
According to my quick AI query, the answer is yes. But we'd have to dig into that for you, because these AIs are not yet reliable. So we'll find out.
It's kind of like the number of people over 150 that are collecting Social Security. Some numbers, especially coming out of the Trump administration, just aren't reliable.
Yeah. As a rule of thumb, I would not consider the administration to be credible. Don't believe what you hear from them, especially about the economy or these numbers. There is no way there are, hundreds of or thousands of people that are 120 or 150 years old that are getting paid Social Security. There's probably a few. There's going to be fraud in a giant system, but it's not something that is going to make a dent in the federal budget.
The explanation, if you remember the Y2K issue, that the computer programs that were written back in the 1900s used 2-digit years, and a lot of people went in that way, and we've been using 4-digit years since then, but there's a lot of people that still have 2-digit years in their data, and the way COBOL program handles that is to default them. A number of people were defaulted to a birth year of 1875, which made them 150 years old. And that's where that comes from. It's a quirk of the COBOL programming system. I saw one question in here in the chat. I'll have to worry about my hiccups later, but it was about how, there are people who are living in their cars, people who are losing their homes. And the answer to that's true. Just because the country as a whole is doing well does not mean everyone is doing well. We talked about the fact that there are, backing up for a bit, the number of people who are unemployed is in the millions. And so for these people, the 7 million people who are unemployed, or roughly, the fact that it's overall a good economy doesn't mean much for them. We've got a Helen Schrute that has raised her hand. She wants to unmute and ask her question.
Yeah, hi, and it's Schroet. I know it's weird, it's Dutch. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call. You guys mentioned about the post office. I'm doing some postcards, and they gave a date, but if they're laying people off, does that mean, or, can you guys check into whether or not the mail will be delayed? Because they're talking about mailing these out to, like, I have some from Wisconsin and some from Illinois. On the 14th, I think they said to put them in the mail. Do you know what I mean?
I don't know. That's a deep dive that I haven't kept in contact with. You might contact the USPS directly, but its current head is not necessarily somebody that I have much faith in.
Yeah, he's also a Trump appointee businessman that wants to to run a service for we the people like a business, and it's a service. Yeah.
Well, if we look back in history at the businessmen who've been presidents and how that's worked out for us, Biden was not a businessman and, had a pretty good economy. Trump was a businessman, not so good. Obama was not a businessman. The average unemployment rate was high, but it went down over the course of his presidency. It went from double digits down to, as I said, 4.7% by the time he left office. Bush Jr. was a businessman. Clinton was not. Bush Sr. was actually a very, very successful businessman. Reagan was not.
Well, they were all in politics, weren't they? I mean, the Bushes and Reagan, he was a governor, so he had some idea of how government works.
Right, but he was not, he was not a businessman. And of course, our Republican friends say that we need to have a businessman in the White House.
Yeah.
Why they argued for Trump. Carter was actually a small businessman, a peanut farmer who gave up that profession when he entered the White House.
I believe he was a governor. And
yeah, he had been a governor.
Senate. I just program on him, yeah.
So let's move on to GDP numbers, gross domestic product, which is, I think, a little over 20 trillion these days. So measure the national output, the size of the economy. Gross domestic income is a measure of the national income and roughly equals the gross domestic product over time. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Commerce Department, reports GDP quarterly. It then adjusts the figure twice over the next 2 quarters. So the first report is a preliminary number. It then gets additional data and refines that number. So the first, what we're dealing with right now is fourth quarter of 2024 GDP, which was reported at the end of January. The end of February will get an adjustment. The end of March will get an adjustment. And the end of April, we will get the first estimate of the first quarter of 2025 GDP. The way these numbers are calculated, the first quarter is basically, it's weighted to be a January number. The second quarter is weighted to be an April number. The third quarter is weighted to be a July number. And the fourth quarter is weighted to be an October number. So the way I look at it is that the best way to measure presidential is to assume that the first quarter is the prior president's thing, and that becomes the baseline for the new president. Now, the new president can have an impact on that first quarter numbers because it includes data from February and March, but it also includes data from November, December, and January. So again, it's weighted to January. And we talk about this, the media will typically announce the real GDP growth rate, which is an annualized rate. So if we hear that the real GDP growth rate was 3%, it didn't grow at 3% in that quarter. It grew at something that equates to 3% on an annualized basis. And GDP is made up of the personal consumption of households, the investment by business, government spending, plus exports minus imports. If government spending doesn't change, that won't affect the GDP growth rate. Change is required. Consumption is about 70% of GDP. If we look at this, is where we see that GDP was about 21 trillion prior to the pandemic. It got back to that level in the first quarter of 2021, and it's been going up more or less since then. It's now up to $23.5 trillion. So it's gone up, it went up by $2.5 trillion since, and this is versus the fourth quarter of 2019. It really should be, okay, so pre-pandemic, it's gone up $2.5 trillion. It's also gone up $2.5 trillion since Biden took office. These are the components of GDP. You have this chart in the PowerPoint that we shared with you. I see there's a hand raised, Josephine. If she wants to unmute, I'll take her question now.
Yes, thank you. Could you say arithmetically how weighted to January actually is calculated?
Sure. For the first quarter GDP number, which will come out at the end of April, it is 1/9 November, 2/9 December, 3/9 or 1/3 January, 2/9 February, and 1/9 March. Which is why I say it's essentially, it's more of a January number than an end of the quarter number. That answer your question? Apparently, yes. Okay.
Sorry, she muted herself and I can't unmute her. So,
That's okay.
I mean,
yes, that was basically what the meeting was.
This is the math for people that are interested in it. I mean, the consumption by households is about 70% of GDP. So when you hear people saying GDP under Biden was driven by federal spending or this or that, they're just wrong. It's really, you don't get GDP growth driven by government. It's driven by what the consumers are doing. And stimulus can help. It can move the dial a little bit, but it's really the C components of that. And then the math is it's the C stuff. So that's consumption. It's I, which is investment by businesses. G is government. X are the exports, and M are the imports. Imports are a negative. Imports are, think of it as a negative to GDP, while exports are a positive. So the money spent on imports is not producing anything in the United States. We're buying stuff that was made overseas. So that money is taken out of the computation. And you can see it's 23 trillion, and that's real GDP. So that's adjusted for inflation. And I have to check, I think it's 2017 dollars, right? Karl, I think that last slide or the first GDP slide said that that's the year that they're using as year zero on inflation. So it's not current today's dollars. It's 2017 dollars, but still it's a giant number. It's so huge that it doesn't make any sense by itself. I mean, I can't 23 with an awful lot of zeros after it, but that's the math behind it. And just don't assume, federal government is not going to doesn't move the dial enormously one way or the other.
Yeah. Tony has a question. Tony Litwinko, if you want to unmute yourself.
The big question is, if that's the percentage of GDP and it's from consumer spending, then can't the argument be made that the Republicans are making that inflation in the cost of living is contributing a good bit to that?
This is real, so it's been adjusted for inflation. So this is and it'll be easier when we show it as, what's a better way to show it? you would have to, let's look at the GDP growth. Hold your question just for a second, because we'll explain it when we're talking about growth in the number. We're talking about the level here, but this is adjusted for inflation. It's always, this share is not going to change whether you adjust for inflation or not. It's going to look like this.
Okay.
Let's talk about growth, though, and then it's going to make more sense when we talk about it there.
Okay, so here's this quarterly growth on an annualized basis. What we see is that starting with third quarter of 2023, we had quarterly growth over 4%, fourth quarter a little over 3%. First quarter of last year was about 1.5%, back up to 3% in the second and third quarter, and a little over 2%, 2.3%, I think, in the fourth quarter. Yeah, 2.3. I remembered that correctly.
And these are real, meaning what you would have to do to know what the nominal growth is, you would have to add the inflation rate to that. And so GDP in that last quarter, 2.3, let's figure 3% for inflation approximately. And so the nominal growth was 2.3 plus 3 would be 5.3%. And that would take into account the price increases. Think about this as the units of stuff that were produced. It's real, so it's adjusted for inflation. It's not distorted by price increases. The nominal number would be, and that would be, 3% higher than this. Back a few years ago, 2022, inflation was more like 9%. And so if you reported 3% real growth plus 9, you had the economy growing at 12, and that would be the reflection of the price level going in there. But this is real, so this is adjusted for inflation, takes the price increases out. Think of this as how much more stuff the economy is producing.
And again, here's the things that have contribute to the fourth quarter real GDP growth. Again, it was mostly consumer spending. Government spending went up a little bit. Imports went down. Exports went down. And investment went down. And so we had a number of things that contributed to get to the 2.3% growth rate. And is this what the Bureau of Economic Analysis posts as their annual numbers?
This is a Washington Post article, and they cited the Bureau of Economic Analysis, so I included it as written. I'd have to check it to see if that's the actual number that they're using. Sometimes these guys will go quarter 4 to quarter 4 as opposed to sort of middle of the year to middle of the year. And so you just have to check to see which version they're using.
Yeah, the Commerce Department does sort of a middle year thing, which isn't terribly useful. Fourth quarter to fourth quarter is better. First quarter is even better, as we talked about. But in any case, this was what was published at some point. And we see is that recovering from the pandemic, we had really good growth. And since then, we've had pretty steady growth.
And Karl, those are the Commerce Department numbers. I'm just looking at the GDP tables that they publish, and those are the right numbers. 28, 29, 25 would be the middle of the year to middle of the year numbers.
Yeah. Okay. So those should not be used for comparing for presidential terms. And this is real GDP growth by presidential term.
What he's really saying here is that the GDP fell below the pre-pandemic trend for a while, then it caught up, and now it's actually ahead of the pre-pandemic trend. We've had very solid growth, and it was mostly driven by immigration. Bringing in, when we had 12 million job openings, an enormous number of immigrants came here, and Biden was like, bring them on. And that probably didn't help with the election. This country doesn't like having a lot of immigrants coming in, or the view that the border is unsecure. But from an economic perspective, it was a giant win for the U.S. And I'll go through some of the numbers, but they're enormous in terms of the benefits of immigration. They're shockingly large.
Okay. We had real GDP that went up. We see here on a per capita basis, it's also gone up. Again, this is not shared equally by every person in the country. So do we have any questions about GDP? I know we had a few questions during the presentation. Any hiding in the chat that I haven't gone and looked for yet?
I've been trying to keep up as we go.
Okay.
There's a good question on there about does reducing taxes grow the economy? And when we talk about the budget deficits, we're not doing it this month. We've done it. We do it probably every other month. We hit the budget deficits pretty good. Certainly, cutting taxes when you make the deficit bigger is going to boost the economy. You get a better return on your investment through spending. Like putting a check in somebody's pocket is going to have a lot more what they call bang for the buck or an economic multiplier on GDP than a tax cut for rich people who will just put it in the stock market. But it's not an efficient way to do stimulus. But whether you cut taxes or you increase spending, you make the budget deficit bigger, and that boosts the economy. So there's nothing economically wrong with cutting taxes to boost the economy. Kennedy did it. The debate that most of us have as progressives, I think, with the tax cuts is that they are disproportionately skewed to the wealthy, that the wealthy get a bigger percent tax cut than the poor. And that's what we have problems with. But from an overall economic perspective, it's just an inefficient way to boost the economy. A much better way would be, tax the rich, spend that money, or give the poor a tax cut, or in the case of the poor don't have a lot of money, give them a tax credit and let them spend it. It's a much more efficient way to boost the economy than the Republican-style tax cuts for the rich. As I've said in these meetings before, the Republican Party is the party of capital, the party of the 1%. And they build a coalition of all different groups to try to do that, to cut taxes, to deregulate the economy. And they throw enough of a bone to the poor people to get them on board with the idea of at least having a small tax cut. And in fact, as we'll share with you as we talk through these sessions, the economy does much better under Democrats. It's not close. Biden had, for example, the lowest unemployment rate of any of the last 14 presidents, and that's a gigantic accomplishment. And, it's just, there's no reason to vote Republican on the economy ever, ever. You just don't need to do it.
If you're a billionaire, there is.
Yeah, if you're a top 1%er, yes, absolutely. But if you're in the bottom 99%, probably not. And, so you'll hear they have all these different arguments and stories they make up for why they do things the way they do, but they're almost all nonsense. And, there's a reason why the economy does way better under Democrats, and 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republican presidents. It's just, we do it a lot better. That's all there is to it.
We're lucky.
Josephine has
We're
a question.
We're very lucky. That's right.
Looks like Sonny has a question, hand raised.
Josephine was first.
Okay, Josephine was first.
Thank you. I read somewhere a long time ago that if there's like natural disaster where that's like what's been going on in California and North Carolina and other places, that because there are so many losses, there's a subsequent increase in spending to have to clean up everything and rebuild everything. And that actually boosts the GDP in a perverse way. Is there truth to that? And does that suggest that there are people who may actually have an incentive to have these natural disasters continue because they get some sort of benefit from it?
Well, if you are an insurance company, you're probably not on board with the idea of destroying all these homes because they're on the hook for the claims, right? But no, what you said is absolutely true. And it has a name in economics, and I forget it. I think it's called the broken window fallacy. Although it's not a fallacy at all. If you break the windows, so to speak, and then hire repairmen to fix them, you are generating GDP. There's no doubt about it. And you are putting people to work. You're putting the glass people to work. You're putting the construction people to work. There's no doubt it boosts GDP, but that's not a desirable way to do it. I mean, again, there are better ways to do it than breaking a bunch of windows and getting them repaired. But yes, in strict math terms, it definitely is. It boosts the economy.
Although I'm not sure how big of an impact there is, really.
Yeah. Well, if you were to rebuild California, all those houses in the exact same place for the exact same money, you got a pretty serious stimulus going on, at least for the California economy, and probably workers coming in from a lot of other places. Construction workers tend to be mobile to come in and fix that. So certainly the destruction in California is going to be a nice boost to the California economy, but it's of course horribly disruptive for the people that own those homes and the insurance companies that are going to be on the hook for paying for all that construction, and they will raise premiums, right? I mean, everything in the economy tends to ripple. It's always hard to know how far those ripples go, but they touch so many different things. But when you break the window, yeah, other things equal, it boosts the economy, but that's not the way you want to do it. So,
Sonny?
Thanks, Christine. Karl, David, I think that you're making this very, very academic. We're talking about GDP and the economy. Taxes are raised so that the government can provide the public services, and to cut taxes is to reduce those public services. And I don't think there's any discussion about that. And there are some big things that have happened. I just looked at the infrastructure bill. There have been many others that are funded fundamentally from public taxes. So I think that we have to keep that in mind and not just talk about the economy and GDP, but actually what are we losing in terms of public services?
Okay. I mean, we don't think we should have laid off the nuclear safety workers or the FAA workers a couple of weeks after the crashes. What do I know? But if you're a Trump, Musk billionaire, you want to lay off all the IRS employees you can.
Precisely. I'll just finish. That's a good point. When the IRS was funded, they actually created more revenue than the cost of the funding of them.
Right. So it will actually, laying off those employees will probably drive down revenue, but it will help Musk and Trump and their fellow billionaires.
Thanks, guys. Okay. Carry on.
Fred.
Christine, can you call the next person?
Fred 68.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I was wondering if those destructions should not be, we mentioned forests burning, California have destroyed. But shouldn't we subtract those destruction from the GDP? I mean, all those houses that got destroyed, they are not part of the GDP anymore. They've been actual destruction.
Yeah, you're right. GDP does not measure wealth, right? If there's
right.
the wealth destruction, that's in the net worth numbers, and it's not going to be in there. So there are arguments out there that GDP should be revised and adjusted for different things. It just hasn't happened. But yeah, there are arguments that can be made to change the math of GDP to reflect different value systems. And it just hasn't happened in the numbers that we do it. The way the US does it is fairly comparable to the way other countries do it. So you can kind of compare the growth rates of different countries. So there are a lot of issues that go into changing the GDP, but certainly people can adjust for various factors, and I'm sure they have. I haven't seen those studies, but you can. But it does show up in other places. It can show up in net worth. If people did not have those homes insured and they all got burned down, their net worth is going to be significantly reduced. So, all right. Do we want to take a short break here? It's 8:00 before we jump into the back half of our program that gets into, we had some requests on kind of how are the African-American families doing relative to the others. So we've got that covered. And then a bunch of economic measures that get into inflation and those net worth numbers, kind of how households are doing. We've got that in some of the other economic measures, along with some immigration info. It's sort of our miscellaneous section for a lot of different subjects.
We've got a few more people that have their hands raised. And let's do those before we take a break.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think my issue has to cover economic measures, probably with both African American families and with Americans in general. So we could, I don't know, take a break, and then we could come back and just pick up where I left off.
Okay.
All right.
Who else is in the queue for raised hands?
Hold on. Let's let Helen unmute and talk.
Okay.
Okay, hold on. Oops, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make one point about talking about, I guess, FEMA and rebuilding. I think that people have to kind of wrap their minds around that this is not normal. He is vindictive. One of the things I understood was he turned down help to Brian Kemp of Georgia because he's spiteful, because he said, I don't know, said something negative about Trump or something. I don't know, but he's so thin-skinned and he just doesn't care. He doesn't care about anything you're talking about. He's just a wild, I don't know, maniac.
We're
he
not
just
here to
doesn't-
solve. No, we agreed. I agree with everything you said. We're not here to solve all those problems. We are here to give you the facts on what's going on in the economy as it's measured, and not just at the highest level, but we also break it down into how different groups are faring. You'll see some of the slides in the other economic measures, so they're not all at the highest level. That we get down into the details of different groups and how they're affected. But it is we can't solve all those problems. I mean, Trump is a very bad person, and we're going to have a rough 4 years. We're all on board with that, and we can help the Democrats craft the best strategy they can, and we'll give you some tips on how to do that as well. But as we've said before, we encourage you to communicate with your senators, your congressmen, and tell them what you want done and how you want it done.
All right. Tamara is next.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, great. Thank you. Just to follow up on what you'd mentioned earlier on GDP and then the tax side of the presentation, I think you mentioned in the last presentation last month, but it's important to know that Congress still has an incredible amount of leverage on money here, and they can do something called reprogramming into certain accounts. So we think that will be going on in certain areas in not only the budget framework, but the appropriations that will be looked at in the next couple of weeks, because the initial deadline to keep the government open is March 14th, as most of you know. And then at the same time, parallel, members of Congress are working on the new FY 26 measure. And just finally, obviously, we know that the freeze and the executive order to redirect funding and to do these terminations is really starting to trickle now. You're starting to see it even today and yesterday with Veterans Administration employees and others that are actually delivering services to people in need. So I do think, I'm not certain what their economic advisors are going to be doing, but the Commerce Department nominee was just confirmed a few hours ago. So I think they're going to be looking at some of these numbers more carefully. I'm not saying they're going to stop what they're doing, but just from the congressional leverage here, as you mentioned earlier, is to continue to weigh in with those elected officials, because they still have incredible leverage and power to help negotiate some of those numbers. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Should we take the break then? Come back at what?
One
eight?
last person before the break. Shannon Williams, please.
All right.
Hi, can you see me?
Yes.
Yep.
I can't see you. All right, so you can see me.
Yes.
And we
Can
can
you see me?
we can see the charts in the chat that you created.
Okay, so can you see my finger?
No.
You can't see me. Okay, so basically I have these charts and I've been passing them out. And like today I went to the mall and people just grab them up, and I've got them real cheap so I can give each person like 10 if they want them, so that they can pass them out. So basically it's a chart of the monetary system. I built it from the Federal Reserve's, the Fed Explained. They have a link to the Fed Explained.
Yep.
And basically, it shows the Federal Reserve and then the money going to the banks and into the economy. It also shows the Federal Reserve and then the money going to the federal government based on congressional approval. And that goes directly into the economy. Then the liquidity is brought back the liquidity is brought back as taxes, or if there or treasury securities. And then on the other side, there's also these the federal. There's another link where it talks about volatility, where the Federal Reserve explains that the money goes directly from the Federal Reserve to the Social Security, Medicaid, whoever the recipients are. And then when we pay our federal taxes, that goes directly back into the Federal Reserve. And I think this image, so many people. I'm going to redo my platform because currently it's kind of political. And like this one man today, he grabbed it from me and he didn't speak English. He spoke Chinese and he was using his little phone.
Let me pause you there. I mean, if you have questions, we'll try to answer them. But the MMT theory, which you have some fans here of the MMT theory, by the way, which I suspect is what you're explaining. We have covered it before. We will cover it again. And I think these charts are very nice. I think that it's a very cool concept. There are some parts of MMT I really like, but this isn't the place to try to explain the theory to folks.
Right.
Let us. We'll take it as an item to do in the future, to do an MMT module, a section, and we're about due for that anyway. We're about to get a very key piece of what we call the sector framework. We're about to get that reported in the current account. Is supposed to get reported, and we'll be able to do the math on all this. But thank you for bringing it up. We do cover this stuff from time to time. All right. Let's take our break.
Time for break.
8:15, we'll resume.